I think we should explore some examples or some mechanisms that have been employed in the bridge building process between cultures. And in my experience in living in various countries of the Muslim Arab world, one of the primary things has been the Islamic translation series. I've given away at least 100 of those books. I didn't pay for them, Dan. I just went in and took them.
True confession.
And gave them. But in each case, it was a very powerful statement. I'd like Dan to explain how that came about. I think it's an incredible story. Maybe some of you have heard it, but if not, a brief statement of that I think would be really useful, because I see it as one of the most effective engagement mechanisms or activities that I've ever seen.
Thank you. Okay, well, this is a story I like to tell.
I know.
Now, when I was a graduate student, I remember being struck by the fact that most all of the major texts of the Islamic tradition were very hard to get a hold of. If you wanted to study, I'd come out of a classics background, if you wanted to study or read, simply have a nodding acquaintance with ancient Greece, it was easy to go to a bookstore. Any decent bookstore would have a translation of Homer or Plato or some of the Greek playwrights, something like that. It was pretty easy to get at least some sense of what they were about. But that was not at all true with Islamic materials. If you wanted to get access to those, you had to, by and large, learn Arabic or Persian, mostly Arabic, difficult, arduous undertaking. And then it was difficult to get the texts anyway. Translations, if they had happened, were rare. If they had been done, they were hard to get a hold of. They'd be 50 years ago in Pakistan or something like that, and printed in 300 copies. So it occurred to me that one of the reasons for the gap of understanding between the Islamic world and the West was simply the West could not get access to those materials, and it used to irritate me, frankly, to read statements in histories of philosophy and science, for example, one of the areas that I work in, when people would make the comment that Western scholars, that the Arabs, the Muslims, transmitted the works of the ancient Greeks to the West, they contributed nothing of any originality. And I would look through the footnotes, I'd look through the bibliography, and I'd think, okay, now there's no clue here that you can read Arabic. These works haven't been translated. How do you know they didn't add anything original? The answer was they couldn't know it, and so that used to bother me when they'd make those sorts of statements. But then I realized it wasn't really their fault. It was the fault of the specialists who'd not done the work that needed to be done to make that story evident. And so I began to think, someone needs to do this. And then I got a call. I won't go on too long with the story. I got a call one afternoon from Alexander Morrison. Some of you may remember him. He's an emeritus member of the 70. Elder Morrison called me up and wanted to know if he could come down to BYU and talk with me about things that the university could do that the church could not do to build bridges with the Islamic world. The idea being that if the church made an approach, it would be seen as, I don't know why Latter-day Saints have a reputation for proselytizing, but we do. It would be seen as a threatening gesture, possibly, but if the university did something, it would not. And he just wanted to send a message of respect and to build bridges. And we came up with several ideas, one of which was for an endowed chair of Islamic studies. I loved that idea because the competition was pretty thin, and I thought I might get it. But the idea that he really liked was the idea of a translation series. Because it would allow us to help Muslims tell their story, but we wouldn't be telling it for them. It would be simply providing an English voice for the great writings of the tradition. He took the idea back to Salt Lake, and it was approved by the presiding brethren of the church, but it was approved in a manner that I'm fond of. It was what they call in politics an unfunded mandate. Yes, do it. No money. You go out and raise the money. So I spent the next several years I began to see myself as a kind of television evangelist, going around and hand out, begging for money. But we finally got it going, and I'll just say that I just came in this morning from a conference we held up in Park City, mostly, to celebrate one of our most recent volumes, The Physics of Ibn Sina or Avicenna. We had a very small conference of about 10 scholars from Malaysia, from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, from Cairo, and so on, brought them together, put them in Park City, had 3 days of wonderful discussions. Muslims, a couple of Mormons, about 3 or 4 Catholics, and the rest Muslims. It was a wonderful, wonderful time, and it just seems to me that this is the kind of thing we wanted to encourage all along, was this kind of discussion. One of the issues that came up was whether there's even such a thing as Islamic philosophy. One of the Catholic participants in the group said, no, there is no such thing as Islamic philosophy. There's no such thing as Christian philosophy. There's just philosophy. We're all humans looking to understand. And you can argue that back and forth on historical grounds, but I kind of like the sort of I don't know, pastoral point that it makes, in a way, that we're all struggling to understand. And so I can say and said in this conference that that I know when my class on Islamic philosophy is working really well, when I get students coming in because they want to study somebody other than Hegel or Kant or something, or they're Middle East studies students because they've heard there are a few famous thinkers, they ought to know something about them. But when they stop thinking of them as old dead Muslim guys, historical figures that they're learning some facts about, and they begin to interact with them, they begin to argue with them and learn from them, and so on. When we're doing interfaith dialogue without remembering we're doing interfaith dialogue, we're just, it's Al-Ghazali and some Mormon students talking across the centuries, and they forget that he's been dead for several hundred years, and that he spoke a different language, and that he belonged to a different faith. And that's a time when it's really working well, and I love to see that happen. And so the series, I think, is helping out with that.
Let me add to that. When the first volume, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Ghazali's book, was published, they had a kind of announcement at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. And I suppose Dan and I were the only ones that were there of this group. You weren't there, were you, Blair? And it was really interesting that Elder Neil Maxwell was there. And I can't remember if this was in private conversation or in his public statement. But I was sitting at a table with the UN ambassador from Iran and the Palestinian delegate to the United Nations. It was primarily for United Nations personnel, ambassadors. And Elder Maxwell's answer was, we love 2 things. We love truth and we love people. We think there's truth in these texts, and we think people deserve to know that truth. Our own people and the Islamic world that doesn't speak Arabic. So we want to make these resources available to everybody. It says we have no intent to convert anybody. We want to make this ancient truth available to our own people. We want Latter-day Saints to read it, and we want to make it available to others. So his 2-pronged focus was, we believe we care deeply about truth, and we care deeply about people, and that ought to be enough to justify all of the evangelical TV programs that Dan had to do to raise money to produce that. And I find that is a kind of nice framing of what we talked about yesterday in terms of Joseph Smith's grand principle of friendship. You care about understanding and about people.
I might just add a footnote to that. Just one little experience that I had with regard to the translation series, and I'm certainly, I don't have any messianic delusions or anything like that, but I remember on the morning of 9/11/2001 when one plane had crashed into one of the towers, and my wife called me. I think I was getting ready to go up and teach a class, and she called me and said, you've got to watch this. And so I came in and we watched, transfixed, as I think 2 minutes later the second plane hit the second tower. At that point it removed all doubt. At first I was thinking, well, it could be a ground control error or something like that, but then it was obvious that it was not. And I immediately thought Osama bin Laden, because he had a history of this kind of coordinated simultaneous attack and so on. And I thought, our little series just gotten started, and I remember thinking, what is the point? Trying to build bridges here, and you see something like this happen, there's no hope. It's just, it's so small against something so big as this. You could already see that this was going to have world-transforming impact. And I won't say it was a voice, an audible voice, but very clearly in my head, I still remember very distinctly the thought coming to me and saying, no, it's more important now than it ever was. And for what that's worth, we've kept going with it. I don't see it as having the key to creating world peace by itself, but it's a small thing. It's something we can do.
Following 9/11, Dan and Randy and I did a series of interviews, and I took all kinds of guff from that. I don't suppose you did, because they know you're an expert, but they thought I was just a dilettante. And took all kinds of guff in terms of being too understanding of the Arab world. Let me give another example. Following that, I had taught the previous year, to the school year 2000, whatever it was. I had taught at the University of Jordan, and following 9/11, I got an email from one of the students that I'd had. I was teaching a graduate course in organization theory, conflict resolution to be exact. And the email came, he said, "Dear Dr. Ritchie and Mrs. Lois," my wife and I were there together. He says, "You're the only Americans I know." He said, "And I just wanted to let you know that this does not represent the Islam or the Arab community of which I'm a part." And it was very sweet. And I must have got 50 emails from former students at Birzeit University or the University of Jordan or other places that responded after that, sort of telling me who they were, and this was not who they were. Let me build on another metaphor that Dan raised in terms of building bridges and that Brad referenced. Some of you have heard me tell this, but for me it's an important statement. Like, I don't want to be Masonic either, but I was walking down the hall in the administration building at BYU in the spring of 1989, and I passed the socioeconomic vice president who was responsible for the BYU Jerusalem Center, and this was a 1-minute conversation. He says, "Hi, Bonner, how you doing?" He says, "How'd you like to go to Jerusalem?" I said, "Well, yeah, that'd be fun sometime. I'd like to do that." I'd been once as a tourist, but I said, "Yeah, that would be great fun." End of conversation. I didn't tell my wife about it. And a couple of weeks later, we got a fax. This was pre-email days, from George Horton, who is the director of the center in Jerusalem, saying, "Delighted to learn that you and your family are moving to Jerusalem this fall. How many children are you bringing? What are your needs? So we've been told to take care of you." And mine did come with budget, Dan. But at any rate, I went back to Bill. I said, "Geez, this is not a good time. I meant, yes, I'd like to go, but maybe in a couple of 3 years, not right now." And I gave all kinds of reasons. I was department chair at the time, and youngest was a junior in high school. Lots of things that just didn't make it a good time. And he said, "Well, let's have a meeting and talk more about it." And so he said, "Be in my office next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. So I went to his office, and he said, "We need to go to Salt Lake for this meeting." And it turned out the meeting was with President Hunter, President Faust, and Elder Holland. And after a 30-second small talk, which was about the limit of it, President Hunter says, "Understand you're going to Jerusalem." And I said, I sort of hemmed and hawed, and I said, "Well, I don't know, not really a good time, haven't really decided." He said, "Well, can you decide right now?" And I said, "Well, why?" He says, "You need to go build bridges to the Palestinians." I said, "Really, me? I don't speak Arabic like these three." And I was in a different field. I didn't know a lot about Islam. I didn't know a lot about the Arab world. And I remember very explicitly saying, "Why me?" He says, "I'm not sure, but you should go." And I said, "Okay." We moved to Jerusalem that summer for the year when we first met Steve and Judy Gilliland. But he said, before you go, let me read you something. He read me in detail from the speech that Brad quoted, saying that we should, that the Palestinians, the Arabs, are children of promise and deserve all the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant, and that we ought to understand that and teach it. And then he said, let me read you a scripture. And he read me from the 19th, I don't know if I've shared this with you, Dan. He read me from the 19th chapter of Isaiah, verses 23 to 25. And about every other line he stopped to explain it, or to reinterpret it, or to restate it. Prophets have flexibility in interpretation. It says, in that day, and President Hunter says, that day means a period of peace in the Holy Land, which we must be part of creating. In that day, there will be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria. Now, this is 1989. You couldn't drive from Egypt to Assyria. He said, let me substitute Jordan for Assyria. You couldn't get there because you had to go through Israel. You had to, if you went from Taba, Egypt, you had to go through Eilat, Israel, to get to Aqaba up into Jordan. And you couldn't do it. You know, I did it one time, and I had to take a bus from Jerusalem to Eilat, and a bus from Eilat to Nuebe, and a ferry from Nuebe to Aqaba, and a bus from Aqaba to Amman. It took me 3 days to go 50 miles. Anyway, you couldn't do it. He says, but there will be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria shall come to Egypt, and the Egyptian to Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve together with the Assyrians, and in that day shall Israel be a third in the land with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, mine inheritance. He said, that scripture means that we have a job to do. We need to be a facilitating force in building peace and in creating a mechanism to bring people together. He says, so you go over and you do management training, which is what I do. He says, you do management training, don't charge anybody anything. He says, work primarily with the Palestinians. And he says, learn, appreciate, understand, serve for a year, and then come back and let's talk. So we did. And it was a wonderful year, and as a result of that, I made a lot of contacts at various universities, and have gone back 6 times as a visiting professor at one of those schools in Palestine or Lebanon or Jordan, to somehow try and reach out and build that bridge. It was a very telling metaphor for me because I grew up in San Francisco, and every day I looked out at the Golden Gate Bridge. And I thought, that's a really good bridge. It's the only true bridge in the world, I think. And I said, I want to build one of those one day. This was during World War II. And I thought, if I could just build a bridge from San Francisco to Tokyo, we could be friends with the Japanese and we wouldn't have a war. We wouldn't have to fight. We wouldn't have all these problems. And so I hung on to my bridge metaphor, and I became a civil engineer so I could build a bridge. But then I found myself in Germany commanding a nuclear weapons unit when the wall went up, arming nuclear weapons to blow up the Soviet Union, and decided I needed a different kind of bridge than cables and cold-rolled steel. I needed a bridge of human understanding, so that's when I came back to school. But the bridge metaphor was very powerful for me, and I've hung on to it, and I've established so many friendships and so many relationships in that world, and people that still come back and ask for suggestions. The chief of staff for King Abdullah in Jordan is one of my former students, and people that are opening doors and doing all kinds of things. Anyway, that's my bridge.
It's a wonderful story. I hadn't heard all of that story. I'm really pleased to hear it. I just have a few sort of random notes that I had jotted down, just thoughts that come to me as I think about this theme of bridge building and of Islam and Mormonism and so on. Yeah, there was a slogan Some of you will remember during the Olympics, what was it, 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake, there were banners hanging around Salt Lake City that said, I think put up by the church, friends to all nations. And that simple phrase just really, really struck me. I just thought, what a wonderful thing to be. I can't imagine anything better than to be that. And I sincerely feel friendship with people from every nation that I've ever encountered, have had anything to do with. I remember one particularly moving experience that just something I saw sitting at the Jerusalem Center. We had 2 years in a row I was involved in something called the Trialogue, sponsored by a wealthy businessman now deceased in Salt Lake City. We got together a team of people. I think there were 7 or 8 Muslims, 7 or 8 Jews, 7 or 8 Christians. And I got to participate in that 2 years in a row, once in Austria and once in Jerusalem. We held one day of meetings at the Jerusalem Center. And during one of the breaks, I remember watching a member of the Palestinian negotiating team in the peace talks at the time, and a member of the governing council of the World Zionist Federation, standing together on the patio of the Jerusalem Center, overlooking the landscape of Jerusalem, the cityscape, the skyline, pointing out their favorite places in the city to each other. And I'm not sure that could be repeated right now in the current climate, unfortunately, but there for a while things looked hopeful, and I loved that scene. I loved it. And one of them said to me later on that the only place in Jerusalem where they could come together and talk that way was at the Jerusalem Center, BYU's Jerusalem Center, and I loved that, and that's a role that I would like to see us play. If no one else will play it, I'd love to have us play it, as many as possible play it.
Let me add to that. You know, I don't know what I'm going to say till I hear Dan. During the preparation for the Oslo negotiations, I was invited to spend 2 weeks with Yasser Arafat and the PLO Executive Committee in preparing for the negotiations with Israel. And one of the leaders, one of the members of the PLO Executive Committee said that he hoped the final peace treaty between Israel and Palestine would be signed in the BYU Jerusalem Center because we were the most unifying force in that process. And I remember a concert, every Sunday night there's a concert at the Jerusalem Center. I remember a concert, and I sat between the head of the Jewish Agency, which is a relatively strident group that facilitates the immigration of Jews, especially from Eastern Europe, but from anywhere, into Israel, and many of whom take over Palestinian land, settlements or confiscated housing in East Jerusalem, for example. And on one side was the head of the Jewish Agency, on the other side was the president of Birzeit University. And they both agreed that this was the only place they would ever be together and could talk without feeling threatened or ostracized. But let me mention another bridge building thing that happened. Brad's father was the director of the Church Center for Culture and Education in Amman, Jordan. And one of the times when I was teaching there, Gil Cook arranged for a very extensive shipment from LDS Humanitarian Services. Wheelchairs, playground equipment, medical equipment, hygiene kits, baby kits, food of all kinds. And we had these huge crates coming in, and so a day was arranged for us to break down these crates and to reassemble them in small packets to be delivered into the tribal areas of Jordan. And so we had several members of the branch. There are 3 branches in Jordan of the church, staffed mainly by locals. And you know, we got together. It was hard to find a place, and so we met at one of the king's sisters' homes. Home is a relative term. That had a huge area where we unloaded everything and divided it up, and then went around and picked up the pieces that go in each of these kits. And this very distinguished woman, who I didn't know at the time, came up and well dressed, and she says, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Who are you? It was the king's sister, and she was addressing my wife, and he said, "Why are you doing it? What do you expect to get out of this?" And Lois said, "We don't expect to get anything. We're all God's children. You're my sister, and we love you, and we just want to help you." And she broke into tears, as did Lois. They hugged and embraced and became lifelong friends. And it reminded me in my charge of a statement from President Faust. And he said, "Our first and highest priority ought to be service, not because it makes us look good, but because it's the right thing to do. In our community relations, our motivation ought not be proselytizing. It ought to be making the world a better place. Of course, we're happy to share the gospel with those who are sincerely interested, but it is a consequence, not the motivation of what we are doing." And I found that very helpful to me in distinguishing the difference between a neighbor and a missionary. The two are not mutually exclusive, but they are different roles. And learning to be a neighbor and a friend is a critical part of that process. Let me mention one more thing. In meeting with Yasser Arafat and the PLO Executive Committee, I had dinner one night with Yasser Arafat's new wife, Suha Arafat. They'd just been married a few months. She was 29, he was 63, first marriage for both of them. And she said, since, when was the PLO organized? 67?
67.
Since 63. Arafat became chairman in 67, I think. Anyway, since then, Yasser has been married to the PLO. Now he's married to me, and we're going to have children, and those children must grow up in a peaceful Palestine. She said, therefore, it's time to negotiate the peace treaty. It was an interesting charge. When we came over, she asked me if I knew what I was doing. I said, yeah, I do training. I do workshops. I know how to do that. She says, no, it's more important than that. We've been invited by the Israelis to go to Oslo to negotiate peace. And the PLO Executive Committee split down the middle, and at the end of the 2 weeks, we want it to be a 16-0 vote in favor of going to Oslo. So that's your job, is to convince the other 8. And it was a fun 2 weeks. My colleague Omar Kader was with me, and we had a fun time. But she said the children, we need to do it for the children. She says, I've sort of given up on the adults, but the children deserve better than they've received from either the Israeli or the Palestinian leadership, and we need to make peace for the children. And that then became my second metaphor, following the bridge building, is the children. We need to make the world better for the children. And when I do training programs, I have slides of 100 children. In fact, I shared them with Brian. He's creating a website of kind of an international cooperation, using the pictures that my wife took of children around the world. But the children then becomes a metaphor. They're more than a metaphor, they're real, but they're a metaphor in the larger sense of building a bridge to the future for them. Anyway.
Well, I'll just say a couple of things while I have the mic here. Again, just some random thoughts strung together. The whole question of pluralism is one that is increasingly challenging for religious believers. It used to be possible to sit in your isolated little area where everybody around you held the same belief that you did, and you just knew that all the people out there who didn't see the obvious truth that you had were plainly morally defective or intellectually defective, spiritually sick or something like that. There's something wrong with them that they didn't accept the truth that was so obvious to you. As you live in a world, though, where your neighbors increasingly are people who don't share your faith and yet seem to have their sound faculties and in many cases are decent people, you have to grapple with the question of how is it that they can believe the things they do, or more importantly, not believe the things I do. How how is it that, what's going to happen to them? And let me tell you of a couple of, one unsettling experience that I had and that I've thought about ever since, and then a conversation I had just this morning. You know, I had this, as I say, this conference going on up at Park City, Utah, and it went through fairly late last night. And in fact, I dropped one of the participants off at the airport this morning just before parking the car and getting on the plane myself. A Muslim fellow from the University of Exeter. He told me a story of a conference that he was at where they were looking at the question of the salvation of non-Muslims in Islam. This is going to be, the proceedings are going to be published by Oxford, he thinks, sometime next year, which is something I look forward to intensely. But he said one of the participants there was a particularly hard-line fellow who said, well, look, you know, non-Muslims, I've got non-Muslim friends, they're great people, but they're going to hell. And he said, but we shouldn't treat them badly, because actually, since they're going to go to hell in just a few years, we should treat them especially nice. And, well, that's one way of looking at it, I suppose. But the experience I had was a number of years ago. Some of you may recall
I could say that about some of my Mormon friends.
Yeah, I know.
Or they would say it about me.
You know, but there are plenty of Christians who hold similar views to those. And I remember a number of years ago, and some of you may recall, the Southern Baptist Convention came to Salt Lake City for its annual meeting. It was very much an in-your-face sort of gesture, because how many Southern Baptists are there in Utah? Not very many. But, you know, they were going to reclaim Utah for Jesus and that sort of thing. And anyhow, there was one fellow who came along as a pastor, but more interestingly, a professional anti-Mormon. He actually made his living as an anti-Mormon, head of a ministry based in Oklahoma. I'd corresponded with him for some time. Some of you are aware, I think, that's one of my guilty little hobbies, interacting with people like that. And so I offered to take him out to lunch when he came, and we went out to lunch, 2 or 3 of us with him, and in the course of it, the question came up of the salvation of the unevangelized, and they were quite clear that everyone who had not accepted Jesus was going to hell, simply, and they're going to burn him. It's not just they aren't saved; they're going to be tortured forever and ever and ever. And I said, well, so what about a medieval Chinese peasant? You know, lives in the 11th century, never hears the name of Jesus, never has a chance, and so this person isn't going to be saved, right? No, he's going to hell. And I said, well, that seems unfair to me. And the wife of the pastor said to me, well, maybe God hates the Chinese. And I looked for is there a twinkle in the eye or anything like that? There wasn't anything. And I just found that really unnerving. That was a really horrifying experience for me. I raised that for no point particularly, just to say this is a really vexing issue. And but the thing that bothered me more than even the answer was the sort of easy way that it was stated, the easy way that it was given. Well, you know, so my response to her, I tried to keep control of myself, and I just said, well, what do you think about Catholics? Well, I'm not so sure about Catholics. Yeah, some of them may be Christians. Okay, that's great. I said, so the only people who really stand much of a chance of salvation, in your view, seem to be some of the Dutch and some of the Scots. They're Calvinists. And they agreed. I couldn't believe it. I thought, you can't make this up. I kept pressing them to see where, you know, they'd say, no, that's absurd, but nothing was too absurd. Anyway. Okay, now, on a more positive note, I wanted to tell an experience in interfaith dialogue that I've had. I've had some wonderful ones. Last year, about the 1st of February, I was invited to go down and lecture in Orlando, Florida. Some of you will know the LDS church where I was lecturing. It's right across the street from the Orlando, Florida temple. And the reason I was going there was that there was a woman there who had given some money to my translation project, and her late husband had been Lebanese, and in honor of that she wanted to give some money to encourage understanding between the West and the Middle East. And so as a gesture of thanks to her, I went down and gave, you know, I have a high opinion of myself, right? So the great gesture of thanks for the money is I will go down and speak. Anyway, that's what she wanted. So I gave a speech there at the Orlando Stake Center about Islam and Mormonism. Well, the enterprising public affairs director for that stake invited the imam of the mosque, which was just about 2 miles down the same road, to come to that gathering. And And he came, and he brought about 50 of the members of his mosque with him. It was the first time they'd ever been in an LDS church, and he told me afterwards that the previous Sunday, he normally held a Quran class on Sunday evenings. He had told his Quran class, I'm not going to be here next week, I'm going to a Mormon church service. Any of you who want to come, you can come with me. Well, they all found that very bizarre, but they decided to come. And we had a great time. I mean, after my talk was finished, there were lots of questions. A lot of them centered on, well, what do Muslims think about this? What do Muslims, how do they do this? And well, we had the Imam sitting on the stand right behind me. I thought, this is absurd for me to be answering these questions, you know, have the Imam stand up. And so he took questions and answers and went over very well. He apparently enjoyed it quite a bit because several months after that I got a note from him by email asking me, he said, we have an annual conference on the Prophet Muhammad for the Muslims of Central Florida. Would you be willing to come out and be our keynote speaker? Now, I just thought that was too amazing to pass up, to have a Mormon keynote speaker at a conference on Muhammad. So I really struggled with the talk that I was going to give there, because I wanted to say something that would be pleasing to him and to the Muslim community that had invited me, but also true to my own background. I finally talked about the kind of society that Muhammad's mission occurred within. A society in which it's called in Arabic tradition the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, which can also be translated as something like an age of coarseness or crudeness or something like that. And it was a time when people basically paid no attention to God, as far as we can tell. It was a kind of tribal humanism, some people have called it, but that's to give it too positive a spin. It was all about how much you could accumulate and the honor you could gain in this life, because there's no life after death, at least none to be worried about. You're not accountable for anything at the judgment. It's whatever you can do in this life and get away with, in a sense. And the argument I made was that we are in a culture that is not so very different from that. You see the joking bumper stickers, he who dies with the most toys wins. But there are a lot of people who really seem to believe that's all there is, that's all there can be. And so you just accumulate and have a good time, and then, you know, you die and probably nothing. There's probably nothing there. It's a kind of new age of Jahiliyyah. And so I said that we Christians and Muslims, Latter-day Saints and Muslims, ought to be making common cause against the enemy that's without the walls. And I quoted Martin Luther, of all people. I don't think he lived by this advice all the time, but he did say at one point that we're like people guarding a city. And outside the city are the forces of death and sin and so on and so forth. And we should be shouting encouragement to one another on the walls as the enemy advances against us, rather than, as I would put it, shooting one another in the back. Because we've got big problems out there, and we can make common cause, and we ought to be making common cause together. So one of the things that pleased me most about this was that both the stake president of that Orlando stake of the church and the imam of the mosque immediately began to talk about ways that they could work together after this event, after the two events. A lot of Latter-day Saints came to that conference on Muhammad too. I mean, it was a wonderful night. We had about 1,000 people there, most of whom were Muslims, but 100 or so were Latter-day Saints. And I hoped it was profitable for both sides. But they were talking about doing joint humanitarian work and working together in the community, doing charitable work together. Now that's what I really like, and I think a few hours of charitable work side by side are worth hundreds of hours of theoretical dialogue. Much as I appreciate theoretical dialogue, and I'm much better at it than I am at practical work. But that's what I want to see come out of things like that, is have us work together and get to know one another as human beings who have fundamentally similar, if not identical, values, and care about our children, care about the society they're going to be raised in, or going to raise their children in. There's so much that we can do together, and meanwhile, we have serious critics of religion outside the theistic community who point to religion and say, look, you know, some of our friends like Christopher Hitchens and so on, religion is the source of all the evils in the world. Do away with religion, we'd be living in some sort of utopia, which is historical nonsense, obviously. But the fact is, we religious people have given enough rope to our critics that they can make a good stab at, that's not a good metaphor, good stab at hanging us. Oh, anyway. But there have been a lot of bad things that have been done in the name of religion, and it's the duty, it seems to me, of theists, not only because we ought to be doing good things anyway, but for the sake of the things we believe in, to be showing that religious people are not a blight on society. We can work together. We can do good. We can be a force, maybe the greatest force for good among humanity. Historically, I think we theists have been, but that's a challenge, and to the extent that we have not lived up to our callings, which many of us have not done, and all of us failed to do at various times. We have brought disgrace on the things that we believe in most. And I know the Book of Mormon was quoted earlier, Alma to his son Corianton, the things you do speak so loudly that they won't believe the things I say. So with theism, when the theists are not living up to their commitments, is discredited. That's just one of my thoughts.
Yeah, we're about out of time.
Oh, are we really? Have I gone that long?
There?
Oh, good grief, sorry.
No, it's, you're out of time, Dan.
You should have shut me up long ago.
No, you're fine. We're basically on schedule. Let's field a handful of questions, shall we?
Good for you.
Please.
How do you pronounce your last name, Doctor?
Hat hoot, like a hat and a hoot. Hat hoot.
I see it's an H.
Because when we came, the lady on the phone said, "Do you mean hathout?" I told her, "No, I mean hat hoot." You want to pronounce it hathout? He says, "Okay," but it is hat hoot.
Yeah. Move the mic down.
Oh yeah, you should have had it.
The impetus for most Muslim immigration to Europe and North America is economic or what?
It depends on, the question is the impetus or the drive for Muslim immigration from the Muslim world to America and Europe. Is it economic or what? There are 4 waves of immigrations. If we talk about the very early wave, it was with the slaves, and there were imams and kings amongst the slaves, and this of course dissipated. Then World War I, there was another wave that were very poor people, peddlers walking from door to door because the economic situation over there was terrible. Then after Second World War, we found a mixed kind of people seeking education. The last wave, which I guess I belong to, I am, this Memorial Day was my 39th anniversary as an American. So I am probably, I've been an American older than all the ladies in the room anyway.
He knows diplomacy.
Yeah, learning it the hard way. That wave actually came with different motives. Most of it was escaping dictatorship and persecution back home and trying to find an environment of freedom and democracy. Not all of them articulated it this way, but being one of them, I know that this was a major driving force where a good number of us felt, I don't want my son or my daughter or my grandchildren to be brought up under oppression and dictatorship because it is disfiguring. Then the big chunk after that, with that, is seeking higher education. Ahmad Zuhail, for example, the Nobel laureate, he couldn't have been the Nobel laureate in physics in Egypt. He had to come here to Caltech, to the facilities and laboratories, etc., that appreciated him, and so many others. So education was a very major factor. Then there was economic factors, but in terms of investment. It's not the blue collar, they were people coming to invest, and some of them did very well. So this is a run through this.
Several motives then.
Yeah.
Appreciate the question and the conciseness in the way you asked it. That allows for more questions
In advance.
and allows us to hear our panelists more. Please.
one of the things that's happening in Orange County and has for several years is at the time of Ramadan, there is one Sunday that we are fasting.
Yeah.
And so we have been organizing a break the fast between the Mormon community this year on the 5th of September, where the Mormon community and a particular masjid will break the fast together, share the opportunity for us to see the masjid, to observe prayers, and to hear short messages between the Latter-day Saint leader and the Islamic leader about fasting and what it means to their people.
Thank you.
Yeah, this experience is repeated for several years in several locations, and we have Muslim Jewish breaking the fast, Muslim Mormon, and Muslim Catholics, etc. And I really admire anyone who is not a Muslim who goes through the fasting, because for me to fast, it takes me to believe that it is a direct order from God Almighty to man Hatshepsut himself. So,
The difference is we've been breaking the fast after 24 hours, and you've been breaking it after 8 hours.
no, it's not 8. It's about because we fast from pre-dawn to sunset. But also you do it one day, we do it 30 days. But let us not compete in misery anyway.
Has there been an LDS response to a common word? The initiative from 2007 of a group of Muslim scholars, first the 138, and then many others added their names to the statement.
The question is, has there been an LDS response to a common word, which was a statement that was initiated, I believe, by a group of Christians and then signed on to by Muslims?
Well, as I understand, it was sort of initially a Muslim response to Pope Benedict's...
Oh, that's right. Yes. There has not, and there ought to be. I mean, this is a response to the Regensburg speech.
Right, love of God and love of neighbor.
Right, yeah. No, I'm not aware of anything that, and yet this would be a good opportunity for Latter-day Saints. In fact, thank you for, maybe I'll see if I can push something on that. We ought to be involved, at least in responding our own circles to that sort of thing. It's a valuable enterprise.
I've thoroughly enjoyed the whole conference, but one thing that's baffled me is the handful of times a line has sort of been drawn in who we can dialogue with and who we can't. Whether or not Mormons can dialogue with secularism, militias or not, whether or not theists can dialogue with atheists. Before today's presentation and Dr. Hatut's presentation, I was under the impression that Muslims would only dialogue, or at least lean towards only dialoguing with other or Christians and Jews, basically. But after your presentation, I'm curious how much more dialogue occurs with others.
As a matter of fact, for a long time, I agree. The question is whether Muslims are showing interest in dialoguing with other than what we call people of the book, which are Muslim, Christians, and Jews, because all of them have scripture, and they are coming from the stem of Abraham. How about Buddhists? How about Hindus? And how about different groups? Or even atheists? As I said, the dignity of God bestowed on the children of Adam. And this is verbatim what the Quran said. We believe that people who believe in God and in a sort of accountability and do right deeds, the expression of the Quran, on them there shall be no fear, neither shall they grieve. So this is a wider circle. Wider than this circle is every human being, by being a human being, is entitled to dignity and to safety, etc. I am not talking about situations of war, because this has nothing to do with the norm. The norm is, it is the human family, all of us from a single pair, male and female, made nations and the tribes to recognize and know each other, not to despise each other. The noblest amongst you is the one who heeds God most. This is part of the Quran. Is this happening? No, of course not. I mean, Muslims as close to Islam as Christians are close to Christianity and as Jews are close to Judaism. There is a problem there in each group living up to what they actually claim. And it waxes and wanes. It goes up in certain area, down in another area. For example, you will get, and I'm sure our professors here, you'll get an impression about Islam when you go to Egypt, not because Egypt is the best, but or Tunis, or then if you go to Saudi Arabia, you'll get the vibes will be different. And I think or when you sit down with a group like this versus the models that are feeling that they are the only ones, the others will go to hell, so let us treat them nicely now. Because this is in addition of, excuse me, it's mental retardation, but in addition to that, it is reading the mind of God. This is what I tried to emphasize on God on the very beginning. Who can dare to say what God will do? On a TV debate was Larry King with a gentleman who was very, very enthusiastic Christian. Actually, he stood up and he declared that now I am going to keep my conscience clear. I am telling you, I had a rabbi with me, either you accept Jesus Christ as the Son of God and the only way, or you will go to hell. So I am inviting you to accept. So I told him, you know what? You might be up to a great surprise when we go there. So don't invite anybody to anything that you don't own. I can't invite you. I said you, I give you a free meal in the restaurant while I don't own it. If I own it, I might be nice. But you promising hell and the heavens while you don't know where you are going to go tomorrow. So there are all kinds of people. The point that I'm really self-critical about as people of religion, we should be more forthcoming in our statements, so that we put another alternative on the table of the public opinion, because you know that the others are louder. Bin Laden is much louder than me. When he says something, he's all over TV. For me to appear on a show, it is an act of heavens every now and then. And I'm usually invited, honestly, I'm usually invited to be ridiculed. Then when they discover that this is not the case, they don't invite me again, because there is a mindset. So we need to be more daring. And allow me to go to the bridges again after they covered all the bridges in the world. Bridge, by definition, is to join two opposite banks of the river. If the bridge will join on the same side, it's not a bridge, it's a highway. So to build a bridge, there should be the opposite bank and my bank, and we are willing to go there and allowing them to come here. Number two, if we can't build the bridges, let us not destroy the bridges that are already there on terms of humanity or terms of even need. Last thing, and I promise I'll be quiet after that, is I heard through the discussion that for the church, and who am I to tell the church what to do, but I can always tell what I wish the church can do. Nobody can control my wishes. This is my area of freedom. I heard the expression that the church cannot take any side on a conflict, and I think Palestine was mentioned. And I 100% agree that the church should not take the side of the Palestinians against the Jews or the Israelis, or the Israelis against the Palestinians. But there is a deeper commitment. It should take a stand with justice against injustice, cruelty against compassion. If we can forge a stand like that, it will speak for itself. But to see injustice committed in the broad daylight, and I know my conscience, my Muslim or Christian or Mormon conscience tells me here is injustice. You see it with your own eyes, and I say I am neutral. I don't recommend this stand.
We'll have, wow, that was like 5 more hands that were up than just 30 seconds ago. Why don't we do 3 more questions? Do you have time for 3, Brian?
You have to take this. You are sitting here.
2. You just took yourself out of the running. Your hand was up a minute ago. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I have a question about transnational vibes that you brought up, Dr. Hattu. And
Yeah.
it is, how do we tease out the difference between intercultural diplomacy and interreligious diplomacy? And do we even need to? You asserted that this really can be best done in an American forum.
Yeah.
So can you speak to how we separate that and if we even need to?
I don't think that in America we should separate. We should be very daring, as I said, in asking the questions. I'd like, and this is probably the first time in my 39 years history in America, I'd like someone to say, how about the way you treat women? How about the right of minorities? We should learn to ask each other the difficult questions. And we should be trained to give the honest answer. Otherwise, that what we call diplomacy, whether it is intercultural or interreligious, is a fake. It is an act of being nice, which is very difficult for me most of the times. We have to ask the questions that are actually in our mind and negotiate a solution, and we should be prepared to hear an answer that I don't like, but still he is my fellow American. This is more possible in America than in Europe, and million times more possible in America and Europe than in the Muslim world, for reasons that we all know. You're welcome.
Thank you. Steve?
Dr. Hattu, you struggled in your talk a little bit with the word tolerance.
Yeah.
Could you just comment further on that?
Yeah. Of course,
Restate, please.
whether my struggle with the word tolerance. As a matter of fact, the word is good. One of the few English words that I pronounce without an accent. But I am struggled with the concept behind it, because, as I said, it is based on an assumption that I am good, and because I am good, I'll tolerate the badness in you. And this is a condescending approach to human relations. All of us are good and all of us are bad in certain aspects or another. And the will of God is for us to be like this. And so I submit to the will of God that He told me, you are one family. I give a metaphor away from bridges. I can be born to a family that half of them are losers. They did not happen to me. That's metaphor. Someone can, there are people here who can tell my family what I do. But I have an uncle who is an addict and an aunt who is a lousy woman, and what shall I do? I don't want to tolerate them. I want to accept them. So these relationships in Islam, and I'm sure it is parallel in Mormonism, is to accept and to be kind and to give the full dignity and respect, because this is God-given to you. While other relationships that I make, which kind of friend I am going to choose, or which kind of a spouse I am going to to try to get, or which kind of profession I'll join. These are things that we make. And things that we make, we should scrutinize and be careful, etc., before we do the mistakes. We'll do the mistakes anyways. But relationships that came with the package are coming from God. And this, a bigger family is the human family. We accept it as God. God wanted that.
Please join me in thanking our panelists this evening.